It was supposed to be a revolution, a bold, sweeping reform that would right the wrongs of colonialism and empower the people. But instead, it became a cautionary tale, a story of good intentions gone horribly wrong. This is the story of how Zimbabwe's land reform turned a nation of plenty into a nation of despair. A story that goes far deeper than most people realize. To understand Zimbabwe's land reform, we must first understand the man behind it, Robert Gabriel Mugabe. Born on February 21, 1924, in Kutama, a small mission village in southern Rhodesia, Mugabe grew up in a world shaped by colonial oppression. His father, Gabriel, was a carpenter, and his mother, Bona, was a devout Catholic who instilled in him a love for education. But tragedy struck early. When Mugabe was just 10 years old, his father abandoned the family, leaving his mother to raise 6 children alone. But despite the hardships, Mugabe excelled in school. He was a quiet, bookish child, often seen with his nose buried in a book. The Jesuit missionaries who ran his school recognized his potential and encouraged him to pursue higher education. It was here, in the classrooms of Kutama Mission, that Mugabe first began to question the injustices of colonial rule. Mugabe's brilliance earned him a scholarship to Fort Hare University in South Africa, the only institution of higher learning for Black Africans in the region. It was here that he met future leaders like Julius Nyerere and Seretse Khama, who would go on to shape the destiny of their nations. But it was also here that Mugabe's political awakening began. He immersed himself in the works of Marx and Lenin, and the ideas of Pan-Africanism took root in his mind. After graduating with a degree in education, Mugabe returned to Rhodesia, eager to contribute to his country's development. He became a teacher, traveling across the region and witnessing firsthand the poverty and inequality faced by Black Zimbabweans. But his thirst for knowledge was unquenchable. In 1958, he won another scholarship, this time to study in Ghana, the first African nation to gain independence from colonial rule. Ghana was a turning point for Mugabe. He arrived in a nation brimming with hope and pride, led by Kwame Nkrumah, a hero of African independence. Mugabe was inspired by Nkrumah's vision of a united Africa, free from colonial rule. But it was also in Ghana that Mugabe met Sally Hayfron, a fellow teacher who would become his first wife and a lifelong partner in his political journey. In 1960, when Mugabe returned to Rhodesia, he was no longer the quiet scholar. He was now a man on a mission, determined to free his people from colonial oppression. But the road ahead would be fraught with danger. Robert Gabriel Mugabe joined the Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZANU, and quickly rose through the ranks. His eloquence and strategic mind made him a natural leader, but his activism came at a cost. In 1964, he was arrested by the Rhodesian government and spent the next 11 years in prison. Yet, even behind bars, Mugabe's resolve never wavered. He used his time to earn multiple degrees by correspondence, earning him the nickname the Thinking Man's Revolutionary. When Mugabe was finally released in 1974, the liberation struggle was in full swing. He took command of ZANU's military wing, leading the fight against the Rhodesian regime. The war was brutal, but in 1980, Zimbabwe finally gained independence. Mugabe, the revolutionary hero, became the nation's first prime minister. At first, he was celebrated as a unifier, a man who could heal the wounds of colonialism. But beneath the surface, a darker side was emerging. In the early years of his rule, Mugabe was seen as a pragmatic leader. He focused on education and healthcare, earning praise from the international community. But his authoritarian tendencies soon became apparent. Political opponents were silenced, and dissent was crushed. Mugabe's rhetoric grew increasingly radical, especially when it came to land. Mugabe didn't mince words. He called white farmers enemies of the state and accused them of hoarding land stolen from the black majority. "The land is ours," he declared. "It's not a gift from the British. We will take it by any means necessary." These words would set the stage for one of the most controversial chapters in Zimbabwe's history. To understand Mugabe's obsession with land, we must go back to the colonial era. For nearly a century, Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, was ruled by a white minority. The best farmland was taken from the black majority and given to white settlers. By the time Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, over 70% of the arable land was owned by just 4,000 white farmers, while millions of black Zimbabweans were left with barren, overcrowded reserves. This was the legacy Mugabe inherited, a nation divided by race, wealth, and land. The promise of independence was clear. Land would be redistributed to the black majority. But progress was slow. For 2 decades, the government tried to negotiate with white farmers, offering to buy their land. But the process was expensive, and the funds were limited. By the late 1990s, patience was running out. The pressure was building, and it was about to explode. In 2000, Mugabe launched a radical land reform program. The goal, to seize white-owned farms and redistribute them to black Zimbabweans. But what followed was chaos. The reforms were not orderly. They were violent. War veterans and supporters of Mugabe's party, ZANU-PF, stormed farms, often with little warning. Families who had worked the land for generations were forced to leave. The world watched in horror as Zimbabwe's agricultural heartland was torn apart. But this was only the beginning. At its core, the land reform was driven by noble intentions. Mugabe wanted to redress historical inequities, to give the black majority the land they had been denied for generations. The reform aimed to empower black farmers economically, allowing them to grow crops, feed their families, and contribute to the nation's food security. It was also about rural development, creating jobs, improving infrastructure, and bringing services to neglected areas. And it was about political empowerment, giving marginalized communities a stake in the country's future. For a moment, it seemed like a dream come true. Thousands of black families were given land, and for the first time, they had a chance to build a better future. But the dream was short-lived. The reality was far darker. Many of the new landowners lacked the skills, resources, or infrastructure to maintain the farms. Crops failed, livestock died, and within a few years, Zimbabwe's agricultural output plummeted. The commercial farming sector, once the backbone of the economy, collapsed. Food shortages became widespread, and the nation went from being the breadbasket of Africa to relying on international aid to feed its people. But there was another factor at play, one that would deepen the crisis: international sanctions. In response to the violent land seizures and allegations of human rights abuses, Western nations imposed crippling sanctions on Zimbabwe. The US and EU froze assets, banned travel for key officials, and cut off financial aid. While the sanctions were targeted at Mugabe's regime, their impact rippled through the entire economy. Businesses collapsed, investment dried up, and Zimbabwe found itself isolated on the global stage. Mugabe called the sanctions an act of neo-colonial aggression, a punishment for reclaiming Zimbabwe's land. But critics argued that the real problem was mismanagement, corruption, and the chaotic implementation of the land reform. The truth? It was a perfect storm. The sanctions exacerbated the crisis, but they didn't create it. The human cost was staggering. Millions were pushed into poverty. Unemployment skyrocketed, and as the economy collapsed, so did the social fabric of the nation. Families were torn apart, skilled workers fled the country, and Zimbabwe, once a beacon of hope in Africa, became a symbol of failure. But behind the headlines were untold stories of suffering and resilience. White farmers who lost everything, black farmers who were given land but lacked the tools to succeed, and ordinary Zimbabweans who bore the brunt of the crisis. This was not just a political or economic disaster, it was a human tragedy. But even in the darkest times, there were glimmers of hope. As the West turned its back on Zimbabwe, Mugabe found new allies. China stepped in, offering loans, infrastructure projects, and political support. But this came at a cost. Zimbabwe's resources were mortgaged to pay off debts, and the country became increasingly dependent on Beijing. The land reform, once a symbol of independence, had led Zimbabwe into a new form of dependency. Within Zimbabwe, dissent was growing. Critics accused Mugabe of using the land reform to consolidate power, rewarding loyalists with fertile land while ignoring the needs of the people. Corruption was rampant, and the gap between the elite and the masses widened. The dream of land reform had become a tool of oppression, but the people refused to stay silent. Today, Zimbabwe is still grappling with the fallout of its land reform. While some farms have been revived, many remain unproductive. The economy is fragile, and trust in the government is low. But there are glimmers of hope. A new generation of farmers is emerging, determined to rebuild what was lost. The story of Zimbabwe's land reform is a stark reminder of how quickly progress can unravel. It's a story of ambition, betrayal, and resilience. It's a story of sanctions and geopolitics, of corruption and survival, and it's a story that continues to shape the destiny of a nation. But one question lingers: can Zimbabwe rise again? In the end, the land reform was not just about land. It was about identity, justice, and power. It was a dream that turned into a nightmare, a conundrum that Zimbabwe is still trying to solve. Until the lessons of the past are truly learned, the story of Zimbabwe remains unfinished. If you're captivated by stories of resilience and transformation, I invite you to watch The Forgotten Kingdoms That Shaped Our World, already on this channel. Discover the empires, leaders, and cultures that defined our past and continue to inspire our present. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Together, let's uncover the lessons of history and the power of human resilience. Thank you for watching.